it isn't easy to read a book like the Bible literally because it's full of literal contradictions. And whatever it is, especially the really archaic stories in Genesis, whatever it is, it's not history the way we think of history. And so that's hard for people. It's hard for people to see how that might still be true. If it's not literal, how can it be true? And this is a discussion that I tried to have with Sam Harris a lot, because the atheist types, the rationalist types, there's something they miss. And what they miss is that fiction isn't false. It's not a lie, right? It's not literal, but it's not a lie. And great fiction is true, but it never happened. So how can it be true? And the answer to that is something like, well, there are patterns in things, deep patterns, deep recurring patterns. You know, human nature, the fact that we're human, that the humanity itself is a recurring pattern. It has characteristic shape, and great fiction describes the shape of that pattern. And the greatest of fiction, the greater fiction becomes, the more it is religious in nature. And that's not even a claim about the nature of truth. It's more a claim about the nature of experience. You know, when we say something is profound, what we mean is that it's moving and that it has a broad influence. It's capable of having a broad influence on the way we think and see and act. So if you read a profound book, like one of Dostoevsky's books, you could say of that book, and people often do, that it changed my life when I read that book. And a story that can change your life has a power that is best described as religious. And so religious is a kind of experience in some sense, rather, in addition to a claim about what constitutes truth. And then those stories in Genesis, Cain and Abel, I think, and the story of Adam and Eve, because those stories are so deep that it's almost unfathomable. They get at the most profound of patterns. And so to say that they're literally true is actually to massively underestimate how true they are. Because you could tell me what you did this morning, and that would be literally true, but like, who cares? Whereas if you read the story of Adam and Eve, it's so true that it applies to everyone always. And mere literal truth can't do that. And we don't have a good language as scientists, let's say, as psychologists, or even as citizens. We don't have a good language for that kind of truth. So the first thing about the Bible is that it's a comedy. And a comedy has a happy ending, right? So that's a strange thing, because the Greek God stories were almost always tragic. Now, the Bible is a comedy. It has a happy ending. Everyone lives. There's a heaven. So now, what you think about that is a completely different issue. I'm just telling you the structure of the story. Something like there was paradise at the beginning of time, and then some cataclysm occurred and people fell into history, and history is limitation and mortality and suffering and self-consciousness. But there's a mode of being, or potentially the establishment of a state, that will transcend that. And that's what time is aiming at. So that's the idea of the story. Now, it's a funny thing that the Bible has a story because it wasn't written as a book, right? It was assembled from a whole bunch of different books. And the fact that it got assembled into something resembling a story is quite remarkable. The question is then, well, what is that story about? And how did it come up as a story? And then I suppose as well, is there anything to it? It constitutes a dramatic record of self-realization or abstraction. I've already mentioned that. It's like the idea, for example, of the formulation of the, let's say, the image of God is an abstraction. That's how we're going to handle it to begin with. I want to say, though, because I said I wasn't going to be any more reductionist than necessary, I know that the evidence for genuine religious experience is incontrovertible, but it's not explicable. And so I don't want to explain it away. I want to just leave it as a fact. And then I want to pull back from that and say, okay, well, we'll leave that as a fact and the mystery, but we'll look at this, we're going to look at this from a rational perspective and say that the initial formulation of the idea of God was an attempt to abstract out the ideal and to consider it as an abstraction outside its instantiation. So, and that's good enough. That's amazing. That's an amazing thing if it's true. But I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, let's say. It's a collection of books with multiple redactors and editors. So what does that mean? Many people wrote it. There's many different books, and they're interwoven together, especially in the first 5 books, by people who, I suspect, took the traditions of tribes that had been brought together under a single political organization and tried to make their accounts coherent. And so they took a little of this, and they took a little of that, and they took a little of this, and they tried not to lose anything because it seemed valuable, or it was certainly valuable to the people who had collected the stories. They weren't going to, tolerate too much editing. But they also wanted it to make sense to some degree, so it wasn't completely logically contradictory and completely absurd. And so many people wrote it, and many people edited it, and many people assembled it over a vast stretch of time. And we have very few documents like that. And so just because we have a document like that is sufficient reason to look at it as a remarkable phenomena and try to understand what it is that it's trying to communicate, let's say. And then I said it's also the world's first hyperlinked text, which is that again, and very much worth thinking about for quite a long time. There's 4 sources in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. 4 stories that we know came together. One was called the priestly. There's a source called the priestly, and it used the name Elohim or El Shaddai for God. And I believe El is the root word for Ella as well. And that's usually translated as God or the gods, because Elohim is utilized as plural in the beginning books of the Bible. And it's newer than the Yahwist version. Now, the reason I'm telling you that is because Genesis 1, which is the first story, isn't as old as Genesis 2. Genesis 2 contains, the Yahwist version contains the story, for example, of Adam and Eve. And that's older than the very first book in the Bible. But they decided to put the newer version first, and it isn't, and I think it's because it deals with more fundamental abstractions. It's something like that. It's like it deals with the most basic of abstractions, how the universe was created, and then segues into what the human environment is like. And so that seems to be the logic behind it. The Yahwist version uses the name YHWH, which apparently people didn't say, but we believe was pronounced something like Yahweh. It has a strongly anthropomorphic God, so one that takes human form. It begins with Genesis 2:4. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when, and it contains the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Noah and the Tower of Babel and Exodus and Numbers, along with the priestly version. It also contains the law in the form of the 10 Commandments, which is like a truncated form of the law. There's the Elohist source. It contains the stories of Abraham and Isaac. It's concerned with a heavenly hierarchy that includes angels. It talks about the departure from Egypt, and it presents the covenant code, which is this idea of that society is predicated. This was Israeli society. It was predicated on a covenant with God, and that's laid out in a sequence of rules, some of which are the 10 Commandments, but many of which are much more extensive than that. And then the final one is the Deuteronomist code, and it contains the bulk of the law and what's called the Deuteronomic history, and it's independent of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And so we know that at least now there's debate about this like there is about everything, so I'm brushing over a very large area of scholarship, but people generally assume that there were multiple authors over multiple periods of time, and the way they've concluded that is by looking at textual analysis, trying to see where there are chunks of the stories that have the same kind of style or the same reference. And people argue about that because, obviously it's difficult to recreate something ancient, but that's the basic idea. So it is an amalgam of viewpoints about these initial issues, and that's important to know. So it's like a collective story. Dostoevsky said that in Notes from the Underground, a great, great book. And, he said, I love this. It was an early criticism of the notion of a political utopia. He said, look, if you gave people everything they wanted, they had nothing to eat but cake, and nothing to do but sit in warm pools and busy themselves with the continuation of the species. That was his lines. That the first thing they would do, well, maybe after the first week, was like go kind of half insane and smash everything up just so that something that they didn't expect would happen, so that they'd have something interesting to do. And it's so right, because you know, the utopian notion that if you just had all the material stuff you wanted, that you'd be, well, what would you be? What would you do? Would you just sit on the couch and watch TV? I mean, you'd be, I don't know what, you'd be cutting yourself just for entertainment in no time flat, you know, and that's the sort of thing that people do. And so we're not adapted for security and utopia. We're adapted for a certain amount of security because, you know, we are vulnerable, but mostly we want to have one foot out where we don't know what the hell is going on, because that's where you're alert and alive and tense and with it. And you know, I believe this, and I believe it actually has something to do with the hemispheric structure of the physiology of your brain, is because the right hemisphere looks roughly adapted to what you don't know, and the left hemisphere, and this is an oversimplification, but a useful one, is adapted to the world that you do know, and the right place for you to be is halfway between them. Because that, and you can tell that. That's what's so cool. And this tells you that this is actually reality that's manifesting itself to you. You know, that sense of active engagement you have in the world when things are working well for you, you know, where you should be at the right time. You're alert and on top of things and engaged, and you don't have much of a sense of time, and the sense of the tragedy of life sort of recedes. And that's when you've got one foot where it's secure and one foot out in the unknown. And your brain signals to you that you're in the right place by making what you're doing meaningful. And that sense of meaning is actually a neurophysiological signal that you've got the forces of the cosmos properly balanced in your being at that moment. And that's why it feels so good. And now, well, what else could it possibly be? I mean, you know, our brain is capable of looking beyond our vision. That's what it's for. And that sense of engagement, there's no reason to assume that that's anything but a real signal. And you can reduce it. You could say, well, the problem with being where you know only is that you don't know everything. And that's going to be a problem in the future. And the problem with being where you know nothing is, that's just too much, man. Like, you know, you go into panic mode, and because anything can happen there and you can't handle it. So you got to mediate between those two things. You want to be secure enough so that your physiology isn't revving out of control, and you want to be out there in the unknown enough so that you keep updating yourself constantly. And that's the place where information flow is maximized. And you know that because that's where you are when you're having a really interesting conversation with someone, or you're gripped by a book, or you're really into a movie, or maybe something that you do as you know, apart from your work, or maybe even in your work, you're into it. And that's because you are in the right place at the right time, and your whole nervous system is signaling that to you. And I would say that's the sort of place that you should be all the time. Of course, you can't be, because no one's perfect, but that's the recreation of paradise on earth. It's something like it, because you are in the right place at the right time when that is happening. And so we're mobile creatures, right? We need to know where we're going, because all we're ever concerned about, roughly speaking, is where we're going. That's what we need to know. Where are we going? What are we doing? And why? It turns out that the way that we're constructed neurophysiologically is that we don't experience any positive emotion unless we have an aim and we can see ourselves progressing towards that aim. It isn't precisely attaining the aim that makes us happy. As you all know, if you've ever attained anything, because as soon as you attain it, then the whole little game ends. Then you have to come up with another game, right? So it's Sisyphus, and that's okay. But it does show that the attainment can't be the thing that drives you, because it collapses the game. That's what happens when you graduate from university. It's like you're king of the mountain for one day, and then you're like surf at Starbucks for the next 5 years, you know. So, yeah. So what happens is that human beings are weird creatures, because we're much more activated by having an aim and moving towards it than we are by attainment. And what that means is you have to have an aim, and that means you have to have an interpretation. And it also means that the nobler the aim, that's one way of thinking about it, the better your life. And that's a really interesting thing to know, because, you know, you've heard ever since you were tiny that you should act like a good person, and you shouldn't lie, for example. And you might think, well, why the hell should I act like a good person, and why not lie? I mean, even a 3-year-old can ask that question, because smart kids learn to lie earlier, by the way. And they think, well, why not twist the fabric of reality? so that it serves your specific short-term needs? I mean, that's a great question. Why not do that? Why act morally? If you can get away with something and it brings you closer to something you want, well, why not do it? These are good questions. It's not self-evident. Well, it seems to me tied in with what I just mentioned. It's like you destabilize yourself and things become chaotic. That's not good. And if you don't have a noble aim, then you have nothing but shallow, trivial pleasures, and they don't sustain you. And that's not good, because life is so difficult, it's so much suffering, it's so complex. It ends and everyone dies and it's painful. It's like without a noble aim, how can you withstand any of that? You can't. You become desperate, and once you become desperate, things go from bad to worse very rapidly when you become desperate. And so there's the idea of the noble aim, and it's not something. It's something that's necessary. It's the bread that people cannot live without, right? That's not physical bread. It's the noble aim. And what is that? Well, it's to pay attention. It's to speak properly. It's to confront chaos. It's to make a better world. It's something like that. And that's enough of a noble aim so that you can stand up without, cringing at the very thought of your own existence, so that you can do something that's worthwhile to justify your wretched position on the planet. And whatever it is that is you has this capacity to experience reality and to transform it, which is a very strange thing. You can conceptualize a future in your imagination, and then you can work and make that manifest. You participate in the process of creation. It's an amazing idea because it gives consciousness a constitutive role in the cosmos. Drop what you're doing that's foolish, that you know is foolish. And pick an aim that's worthwhile, to make things better for yourself, like you're worth taking care of, like you're worth something, and to surround yourself with people who believe the same and who are, rejoicing in your accomplishments and unhappy when you fail, right? And you're comparing yourself to your accomplishments of yesterday and not to someone else's today, so that you're not jealous and bitter. And you put your own house in order so that you're not cursing the world when some of its disarray might be your fault. And you're trying to pursue something meaningful, and you're doing your best to tell the truth and all of that. And then you see what happens. Who the hell are you? You think you're a miracle of some bloody bizarre sort. We've been around for 3.5 billion years. Every single one of your relatives propagated successfully. And here you are, against all possible odds, in this world of hell in some sense, and bitterness and tyranny and malevolence. And yet God only knows what's inside you, this capacity for consciousness, the capacity to confront potential and to turn it into something good. That's us, man. That's the Western story. That's the individual as the cornerstone of the state. That's our responsibility, and it really is who we are. And so we need to know that, and we need to remember it, and we need to act it out. And then maybe we can see what we can do about it, and see how good we could make things. And maybe that would be the purpose of your damn life, right? Not to be happy. It's like there's problems to be solved. Be happy after you solve the goddamn things.
Why Twitter is insane. It is often said that social media is driving us out of our minds, individually and collectively. Is this true? And if so, how and why? The eminent social psychologist Jonathan Haidt recently wrote a hard-hitting article showing that use of certain forms of social media, particularly by girls just entering adolescence, was directly and causally associated with higher rates of depression and depression-related symptoms since the early to mid-2010s. I had been thinking along broadly similar lines, particularly with regard to Twitter and how its incentives are structured compared to those that characterize healthy human interactions. The extent of its harmful pathology has recently been brought home to me as a consequence of those deliberations. A thought experiment. Imagine, for example, that you learned a particular pattern of communication in your family, one that, when used on others, triggered a passive or even outright aggressive resistance. By definition, The unusual method of communication you had been taught, one that did not generalize well to the broader social environment, would characterize you, at least as far as society is concerned, as insane. Now, let's ask, how does Twitter, like that family, differ from the real world in how it requires us to communicate with each other? How does it make us, too, insane? The first way is in the manner in which it bypasses the traditional means for measuring the quality of communication. In the real world, high-volume communication is extremely costly, requiring both hard-to-establish credibility, why otherwise would large numbers of people want to read or listen to you, and access to the wealth necessary for such communication, either directly through personal accumulation or by proxy, such as a contractual arrangement with a publishing house. Twitter casts these limitations asunder. The consequence of this demolition of potentially vital regulation is multiplied by the fact that Twitter provides universal access to each of its users' hard-won personal networks. The second way is how anyone, regardless of competence or social status, can comment to anyone else's entire network of followers merely by commenting on something the latter posted. That same commenter, therefore, can access all those who have chosen to follow not them, but the target of their, say, insult and derision, without having demonstrated any of the competence necessary to have attracted such attention on their own. This democratization of communication enables a parasitism completely divorced from competence. It massively inflates noise relative to signal, bypassing all the screening mechanisms that have been so painstakingly developed to shield us from incessant racket in the real world. The third way Twitter breaks the norms of standard human interaction is the zero cost and even potential benefit it imposes on those who engage in flagrant ethical misconduct. It facilitates the implied moral elevation that accrues to the accuser, who adopts the position of virtuous judge merely by formulating an accusation, however vague, ill-founded, and scurrilous. In the same vein, there is no cost for insults, ad hominem attacks, and provocative statements. Incitement, in other words. People can hide behind their anonymity as well and act, if possible, even more brazenly. Too often, therefore, the medium stimulates a reactive rage, as it denies even to competent users two of the main privileges traditionally granted to them: the presumption of innocence and the right and ability to engage in effective self-defense. The mob can say anything at all about you or your thoughts online, despite your hard-earned reputation, and there is nothing you can do about it. Any member of what can far too easily become a mob can level any accusation, no matter how slanderous, against anyone at all, for any reason, and there is little or nothing that the target can do in response. Perhaps most worrisome of all is the fact that this incited rage bleeds over into the real world. All the impotent anger generated is externalized away from the social network and dispersed. Thus, the ambient emotional temperature of general society is raised, degree by degree, to the boiling point. Malignant narcissism. We know this instinctively, but it would be easy to test. An ambitious PhD student, in case one's listening, could expose one group to Twitter for half an hour, another randomly established to another social media network, and a third, if desired, to a reading task. All study participants could then be assigned, say, a competitive aggression research task, to determine if Twitter exposure heightens the proclivity to respond in kind with punishment to provocation. I believe that Twitter's reward structure, even more than Facebook's, incentivizes malignant narcissism. It enables and benefits free riding and prioritizes psychopathic motivation. And it garners disproportionate attention in doing so, capitalizing on the attractiveness of outrageous behavior, while externalizing all the associated and inevitable costs to the innocent, broader society. This is the psychological equivalent of the tragedy of the commons, the psychological equivalent to pollution of the air we all breathe. I recently spoke about all this to the author of the article I mentioned previously, psychologist Jonathan Haidt, and on the same email string to Steven Pinker, the eminent cognitive psychologist. How did my psychologist colleagues react? Haidt noted that Twitter indeed cuts the link between, quote, competence or value creation and prestige/reward. Pinker likewise observed, quote, the contrast between Twitter and face-to-face communication is profound. I have been astounded at how some of my students and younger colleagues think nothing of spitting utterly gratuitous and unjustified snark at respected figures in their fields. I have to remind them that they may meet these figures at a conference someday, or that they might be on their tenure or grant review committees. The transition from meetings to Zoom in the past 2 years may have exacerbated this. But I suspect the main enabler is the sense that their reference group is their Twitter same-age peers, and that they don't have cues reminding them they're part of a multi-generational community.